So today, on behalf of another generation of American leaders and another generation of American citizens, the United States of America offers a sincere apology to those of our citizens who were subjected to these experiments, to their families, and to their communities. When the government does wrong, we have a moral responsibility to admit it.
You have opened the doors of this nation's records, and they must stay open. You have recognized the price of secrecy in research for what it is, a legacy of cynicism and a legacy of distrust. If we are to keep faith with those who have suffered, we must do everything possible to guarantee that what happened to them never happens again.
A report that tells the story of radiation experiments involving human subjects funded by the government.
We have declassified thousands of government documents, files from the Second World War, the Cold War, President Kennedy's assassination.
For 45 years, the United States is said to have been involved in the Cold War, a political rivalry that began following the end of World War II, in which the United States and the Soviet Union saw each other as formidable powers, each with the capability of inflicting destruction upon the other. But how far would they go to prepare for what could possibly happen? Chemical, nuclear, and atomic warfare were hot topics of concern, and the United States of America wanted to conquer half the battle, knowing.
Civil Defense radiological teams, equipped with radiation survey meters, will check on contamination in any bombed area. Yes, the knowledge is ours.
Yes, we certainly wanted the knowledge to be ours, but what lines were we willing to cross to obtain it? Fear of the current weapons advancements drove the United States government to yearn for any understanding of the effects of radioactive exposure on the human body. We wanted to understand the effects of plutonium, uranium, and other radioactive materials on the human body for two things: weapons advancement and treatment advancement for soldiers and military. How could we ever get this information accurately in the 1940s in an ethical way? We couldn't. From 1944 to 1974, the government sponsored radiation experiments involving human subjects. Not only did these experiments involve harmful treatments, but they also operated out of a false front, often capitalizing off of those who needed help the most: terminal cancer patients. The researchers reportedly told patients and their families that these were cutting-edge technologies and advancements in cancer research. The reality was, these people were demeaned to lab rats for these researchers, just curious about what would happen to the human body after being injected with radioactive actinide metals. One of the most unethical and appalling decisions made by the researchers included the decision to inject 18 confirmed patients with plutonium. This was done without their knowledge and certainly without their medical consent. Plutonium is an actinide metal, meaning it only exists in a very unstable state and is a radioactive isotope. It undergoes radioactive decay, which emits energy in the form of ionizing radiation that can take different forms. If this is being ingested or injected to the human body, it's frightening to think about what it was doing to the internal systems of these individuals. Plutonium has been regarded as the most toxic substance known to man, which according to some sources is capable of causing genotoxic and malignant alterations to the entire population of the Earth. According to some information, 1 pound of plutonium could cause 8 billion cancers, according to the National Library of Medicine. According to the task force created by President Clinton in 1994 to declassify thousands of documents and make a comprehensive report on the human radiation experiments, plutonium has no medical uses. According to a peer-reviewed article on these actions, on July 18, 1947, 3 doctors and a nurse entered Ward B at the University of California Hospital and injected plutonium into 36-year-old Elmer Allen's left leg. 3 days later, the leg was amputated at mid-thigh. His hospital chart states that the limb was sent to pathology for radiological study. Allen had been misdiagnosed as having pre-existing bone cancer. In fact, he had fallen from a train in the late summer of 1946 and had injured his left knee. Allen lived until June 10, 1991, with horrible complications resulting from the plutonium experiment. He suffered from alcoholism, epileptic seizures, and was eventually diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, which his family doctor believes resulted from his feelings about how he had been exploited in the plutonium experiments. This patient was in no need of an amputation and was misdiagnosed. It seems that before taking such a large leap as to amputate the leg, these doctors would run multiple tests and second opinions, so this shows a level of unprofessionalism to some degree. The use of a plutonium injection, and later use of the amputated limb for testing in regards to radiological study does point to large warning signs of underlying intent. There was clearly no regard for the trauma of such a procedure, especially after the patient realized it wasn't necessary. The rest of his life was riddled with physical and mental complications as a result of what his doctor referred to as being exploited in the plutonium experiment. His right to informed consent was taken, and with it took his trust in medicine, the government, and a physical part of himself as well as a mental portion of himself, gone forever as a result of an unethical government-sponsored study to which the degree of the effects was not known and the regard for the most basic of American citizens' right was discarded without second thought. Unfortunately, Alan was not alone in his misfortune. Multiple sources tell the story of Simon Shaw. In January 1946, a 4-year-old Australian, Simon Shaw, was diagnosed as having a highly malignant form of bone cancer. In a desperate effort to save the boy's life, his parents decided to bring him to the United States for further diagnosis and treatment. The family had been referred to the University of California Hospital in San Francisco. Once in America, Simon didn't receive the life-saving medical treatments his parents desperately sought. Instead, he was ensnared in a hush-hush, extremely unethical medical experiment. Simon was one of the 18 supposedly dying patients injected with deadly, radioactive plutonium by scientists working for the Manhattan Project, the organization that produced the atomic bomb. Concerned about the dangers of radioactive material on nuclear workers, the United States government officials wanted to discover how the human body eliminated plutonium. Now, these stories certainly beg the question, who all was involved? If this was supposed to be ethical cancer research, I would wonder who was supporting, sponsoring, and funding the project. A hospital, a cancer research organization? Actually, these experiments were conducted and sponsored by the Manhattan Project, the Atomic Energy Commission, and the Energy Research and Development Administration, all predecessor agencies to the Department of Energy. In addition, many reports are addressed to the Department of Defense regarding information such as a report by Dr. Sanger that reads, "Whenever possible, indirectional radiation will be attempted, since this type of exposure is of military interest." An examination of the so-called treatment methods used by Sanger in his studies reveals much about the true purpose of the experiments. Patients received treatment while sitting with legs raised and head tilted slightly forward. This position mimics that of a soldier in a protective fetal position. The single doses that each of the cancer patients received resembled the dose rate of a nuclear blast. One of the program objectives was to determine if aminoaciduria, an abnormally high amino acid content in urine, was an indication of the impact of radiation on humans. The highest dose planned to be administered was 600 rads, enough to potentially be very lethal. In this program, the Army proposal did not mention or give any significant premise relating to cancer research as a purpose in the study. The reports did say, however, that the purpose of the study was to learn more about the acute, meaning more intense or sudden but not chronic, and the subacute or more intense results requiring specialized medical services, effects on American troops. This was to be used to provide combat effectiveness to these troops, and definitely not medical treatment advancements for cancer patients. In addition, Dr. Sanger's patients had cancers that would be virtually unaffected by radioactive treatments as were central to the experiments. This was to ensure that the results and symptoms of the treatments could be cataloged as a symptom or a result of radiation poisoning and not necessarily cancer treatment. This shows the patients were only there for the betterment of military knowledge, and by these treatments were knowingly having no positive effects on their cancer diagnosis, were only causing more harm as a result of needless radiation exposure. President Clinton's task force also found that commonly, relatively healthy cancer patients were chosen so that the effects of their illness would not obscure those of radiation exposure. Although many researchers claimed to have obtained informed consent, the investigators often couldn't find any supporting documentation that such consent was given. And when documentation was available, it seemed that often subjects had not been fully informed of the risk and side effects of total body irradiation, or the military purpose of the experiments. Those in charge of the Cincinnati locations testing in hospitals disallowed the staff to offer treatment for the patient's intense side effects as a result of the radiation and made them sign a form outlining the prohibition of such care. This was likely to ensure the researchers' results were accurate to what the soldiers could experience in the field and see the genuine effects of whole-body radiation. This seemingly violates the Hippocratic Oath, as well as which at the time had doctors pledged to abstain from whatever is deleterious or mischievous, and give no deadly medicine to anyone if asked, and to abstain from every voluntary act of mischief and corruption. To add insult to injury and make matters worse, many of the family members of patients testified that their family members were in relatively good health before receiving the experiments. Those who lived with the patients for years before and after the experiments reported having seen a deterioration in their family members after the researchers' treatments. Of these individuals were those with incurable cancers, but not cancers that were predicted to end the subject's life substantially prematurely. These patients were exposed to TBI, a rather intense process that can commonly have results such as destroying blood cells, lymphocytes, neutrophils, platelets, and red blood cells, and potential damage to the lungs, GI tract, skin, liver, kidneys, and lens of the eye. These procedures harmed patients who did not need to be put under these types of treatments and deteriorated and diminished their quality of life. It clearly violates the favorable risk-benefit ratios outlined by the Human Research Ethic Guidelines by the National Institute of Health. One of the most repugnant of Cold War-era experiments was carried out on mentally disabled children at the Fernald State School during the 40s and 50s. 19 boys believed they were beginning members of a science club, but they were actually drinking radioactive milk. Beginning in 1949, the Quaker Oats Company, the National Institute of Health, and the AEC fed minute doses of radioactive materials to boys at the Fernald School to determine if chemicals used in breakfast cereal prevented the boys from absorbing iron and calcium. The consent form sent to the boys' parents made no mention of the radiation experiment. The extent of these studies even goes all the way to NASA. NASA sponsored a study in attempts to understand the effects of radiation on astronauts in space via cobalt and cesium. To do this, they had a room specially built with walls containing the radioactive components, and 200 civilian patients were placed into this room referred to as a sea of radiation. And in 1949, researchers at Hanford Nuclear Weapons Plant released 7,800 curies of radioactive iodine into the atmosphere to test the effectiveness of radiation detection equipment. Again, nearby residents weren't warned about the test. This weapons plant has since been shut down after many safe disposal and safety procedures weren't followed, and significant portions of radioactive material were released into the air in the surrounding Columbia River. The facility was known for being incredibly irresponsible with their disposal practices and has 56 million gallons of radioactive waste in underground tanks, while the waste that could be buried was buried underground all over the site. This is also the site where the first atomic bomb was developed. Now, they released 7,800 curies of radiation into the atmosphere. 1,000 to 5,000 curies is enough to cause illness and death within days of exposure. Again, nearby residents weren't notified of this test. If you're thinking what these individuals did was horrifically unethical, you're not alone in that thought. Christine Castle, University of Chicago Department of Medicine and past president of Physicians for Social Responsibility, points out that the ethic principles of scientific research weren't invented yesterday. The Nuremberg principles arising from the trial of Nazi war criminals for crimes including human experimentation were well known to all American scientists as soon as they were published. The very first principle actually states the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. The government and the President of the United States had to expose the extent of this project and offer any compensation to families or survivors possible as a sincere apology for their appalling behavior. Based on the Nuremberg principles, the guidelines for ethics in human experimentation, the Hippocratic Oath, laws on informed consent, and blatant misinformation via an organization's own benefit at the cost of the public, these experiments were undoubtedly unethical in every way.
Thousands of government-sponsored experiments did take place at hospitals, universities, and military bases around our nation. The goal was to understand the effects of radiation exposure on the human body. While most of the tests were ethical by any standards, some were unethical, not only by today's standards, but by the standards of the time in which they were conducted. They failed both the test of our national values and the test of humanity. In one scientist injected plutonium into 18 patients without their knowledge. In another, doctors exposed indigent cancer patients to excessive doses of radiation, a treatment from which it is virtually impossible that they could ever benefit. To continue to research, but there is a right way and a wrong way to do it.